The story of Louis Asa Asa begins not in the coastal slave markets of West Africa, but in a village far inland, in a place he called Baikla, near a larger town named Egi. Scholars haven't been able to pinpoint exactly where these locations were, which speaks to how thoroughly the slave trade erased the identities and origins of the people it consumed. Some researchers have speculated the region might have been in what is now Nigeria, possibly in the interior regions where Yoruba and other ethnic groups predominated. Others have suggested different locations entirely. The uncertainty itself tells us something important about how the slave trade functioned, how it deliberately severed people from their geographic and cultural roots, making them easier to control and less likely to escape back home. What we do know is that Louis lived in a large village, some distance from the sea, in what was likely the interior of West Africa. His community would have been part of complex social structures, with their own governance, religious practices, economic systems, and cultural traditions. Louis had parents, siblings, a community, a life that made sense to him. He had skills he was learning, responsibilities he was expected to fulfill, a future he was growing into. He was, by his own account, around 12 or 13 years old when everything changed, an age when he was transitioning from childhood to adolescence, when his identity was forming and his place in his community was becoming clearer. One day, raiders came. This wasn't unusual in the early 19th century, when African kingdoms and armed groups conducted raids specifically to capture people for the slave trade. The demand from European traders had turned human beings into currency, and entire economies had reorganized themselves around this commerce in flesh. Some African states had become dependent on the slave trade for their own survival, using the guns and goods they received to maintain military superiority over their neighbors. Others conducted raids defensively, capturing people from rival groups before they themselves could be raided. The system created a vicious cycle where the presence of the slave trade itself generated the warfare and instability that fed more people into slavery. Louis and other members of his community were seized in this raid and began a journey that would take them hundreds of miles from everything they knew. We don't know the specifics of his capture, whether he was taken from his home in the night, whether he was seized while working in fields or traveling between villages, whether he witnessed violence against his family members or was separated from them without knowing their fate. The narrative he later dictated doesn't provide these details, perhaps because they were too painful to recount, perhaps because his transcriber didn't think to ask, perhaps because 5 years later the specific memories had blurred into general trauma. The march to the coast was its own nightmare. Louis later stated that he traveled more than 1,000 miles, a distance that would have taken months to cover on foot. He was taken with other captives, forced to walk through terrain he didn't know, through the territories of people whose languages he might not have spoken. They traveled in fear, uncertain of their fate, knowing only that they'd been torn from their homes and were being taken somewhere for purposes they didn't understand. At night, they rested in temporary camps, possibly bound together to prevent escape, always under armed guard. During the day they walked, often in coffles where captives were linked together by chains or wooden yokes, making movement difficult and escape nearly impossible. The psychological trauma of this forced migration, of being reduced from a person to property, began the moment the raiders appeared in his village. Louis was entering a world where nothing he'd known before mattered. His family connections, his social status, his skills and knowledge, his very identity as a member of his community, all of it was being stripped away. He was becoming what the slave trade required him to be: a commodity, a unit of exchange, a body with value measured only in terms of the labor that could be extracted from it or the price it could command. The captives would have been fed minimally during this journey, just enough to keep them alive and able to walk. Those who became too ill or injured to continue would have been abandoned or killed. Women faced violence from their captors. The strong were forced to help control the weak. Every aspect of the march was designed to break down resistance and individual identity, to transform a group of people with diverse backgrounds and loyalties into a manageable mass of human cargo. When they finally reached the coast after months of travel, Louis encountered the machinery of the Atlantic slave trade in full operation. The coastal regions of West Africa in the 1820s had been transformed over centuries into processing centers for human cargo. European traders maintained forts and trading posts, often called factories, where they negotiated with African merchants and rulers. These weren't just simple trading outposts, but complex commercial operations with warehouses, holding cells called barracoons where captives were imprisoned while awaiting sale, and administrative systems for recording transactions and managing inventory. African middlemen played crucial roles in this system. They controlled the routes from the interior to the coast, negotiated between interior raiders and European buyers, and managed the barracoons where captives were held. Some had become wealthy through this trade, building power bases that depended on the continued flow of enslaved people to European ships. The relationship between European traders and African merchants was complex, involving credit arrangements, diplomatic protocols, and sometimes military alliances or conflicts. Louis was sold, then sold again, then again. Over the course of approximately 6 months at the coast, he changed hands 6 times, traded for goods that the sellers valued more than they valued his humanity. Each transaction involved inspection and evaluation. Traders examined captives' teeth to assess their age and health. They looked for signs of disease, checking eyes and skin. They evaluated physical strength, having captives walk or lift weights. They looked for any marks or conditions that might lower value, including tribal scarification that European buyers associated with being too African and therefore potentially rebellious. Each transaction reduced Louis further, from a boy with a name and a history to an object with a price. With each sale, he moved closer to the ocean and further from any possibility of escape back to his village. The multiple sales also tell us something about the economics of the coastal trade. People like Louis were commodities that moved through a supply chain, with different merchants specializing in different parts of the process. Some controlled the routes from the interior. Others operated the coastal barracoons. Still others negotiated directly with European ship captains. Each middleman took a profit, and the captives themselves were traded repeatedly before ever boarding a ship. The goods exchanged for human beings tell their own story about the economics of the trade. Louis later reported that captives were sold for cloth, for gunpowder, for salt, for guns. The cloth was often brightly colored fabric manufactured in Europe or India, highly valued in African markets for both practical use and as a status symbol. The gunpowder and guns were military technology that gave those who possessed them significant advantages over those who didn't, creating an arms race that drove further conflict and raiding. The salt was a preservative and dietary necessity in tropical climates. He specifically noted that the firearms were English guns, manufactured in Britain and traded to Africa, where they were used to fuel the very raids that captured more people to be sold. This was one of the most damning details in his entire narrative, at least for British readers in 1831. Britain had abolished its participation in the slave trade in 1807, and many British people believed that meant their country had washed its hands of the entire system. But here was evidence that British manufacturers were still producing weapons specifically for the African market, knowing they would be used to capture people who would then be sold to non-British slave traders. The guns that made the raids possible were the same guns traded for the victims of those raids. Louis described how the exchange worked, noting that sometimes traders got 4 or 5 guns for a single person. These weren't simple transactions. They involved negotiations between the seller, who wanted to maximize the value received, and the buyer, who wanted to minimize the cost while ensuring a steady supply of captives. The rates varied based on multiple factors including the age, sex, and perceived strength of the captive, the current supply and demand, and broader political and economic conditions. The inspection process was humiliating and dehumanizing. People were stripped and examined like livestock. Their teeth were checked. Their bodies were inspected for signs of disease or disability. Those who couldn't command a good price might be discarded or killed. The coastal barracoons were disease-ridden prisons where captives were held in overcrowded conditions with inadequate food, water, and sanitation. 15 to 30% of captives died in these facilities before ever boarding a ship. After 6 months of being traded along the coast, Louis was sold to Frenchmen. This was 1825 or early 1826, nearly 2 decades after Britain had officially abolished the slave trade in 1807. But the British abolition hadn't ended the traffic in human beings. It had simply reorganized it. French, Spanish, Portuguese, and American traders continued the business, and even British manufactured goods like those English guns Louis mentioned continued to fuel the system. Some British merchants found ways to continue participating indirectly, financing voyages by non-British traders or providing supplies and equipment. The French traders put Louis aboard a slave ship with 80 other captives. The ship was called the Pearl, a name that would become forever associated with his eventual freedom. The Pearl was likely a relatively small vessel. 80 captives represented a moderate cargo for such a vessel, though the number doesn't tell us how many crew members were aboard, or whether the ship was designed specifically for the slave trade. The conditions aboard slave ships were designed to maximize profit by packing as many human beings as possible into the smallest space. The captives were considered cargo, and the ship's primary concern was delivering enough of that cargo alive to make the voyage profitable while minimizing costs. The hold was typically divided into platforms or shelves, creating multiple levels where captives were forced to lie in rows, often with less than 3 feet of vertical space. Movement was nearly impossible. The heat was stifling. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, vomit, excrement, and death. Some loss was expected. Death rates on the middle passage often ran between 10 and 20%, sometimes higher. Ship captains calculated these expected losses into their profit margins. They packed ships beyond what seemed physically possible because they knew some would die, and it was more profitable to bring more captives with higher deaths than fewer captives with lower deaths. Captives were typically brought up on deck periodically for exercise and fresh air, less out of humanitarian concern than because it improved survival rates. They might be forced to dance or move around to prevent their muscles from atrophying. The treatment varied by captain, by crew, and by the specific economics of each voyage. At some point during the voyage, 75 of the 80 captives originally placed on the Pearl were transferred to another ship. Louis was one of 5 who remained aboard the original vessel. We don't know why this transfer happened or what criteria determined who stayed and who went. Perhaps the other ship had space and the captain was consolidating cargo. Perhaps there were concerns about disease. Perhaps the 75 were intended for a different market or destination. The transfer itself would have been terrifying, carried out on the open ocean with captives being moved between ships. For Louis and the 4 others who remained, watching the majority of their fellow captives being taken away must have been deeply unsettling. These were people who'd shared the same traumatic journey. Their disappearance onto another vessel meant Louis lost whatever small community he'd formed during the voyage. The Pearl sailed north rather than west. Unlike most slave ships crossing the Atlantic toward the sugar plantations of the Caribbean or the cotton fields of Brazil and the American South, the Pearl was bound for Europe. This was less common but not unheard of. Some enslaved Africans were brought to Europe as domestic servants. Others were transported through European ports before being shipped to the Americas. The fact that the Pearl was carrying only 5 captives by this point suggests this might have been the tail end of a longer voyage, with most of the ship's original cargo already sold at previous stops. Or it might have been a small-scale operation, with these 5 intended for sale as personal servants to wealthy families in France, rather than as plantation laborers. Louis's exact intended destination remains unclear. What happened next changed everything. The Pearl encountered a severe storm in the waters off the British coast, probably in the Atlantic approaches to the English Channel. The vessel lost its bearings, battered by wind and waves. For the crew, it was a professional disaster and a mortal danger. For Louis and the other captives below deck, it must have been pure terror. Trapped in a heaving ship with water crashing around them, unable to see what was happening, unclear whether they would live or die. The storm drove the Pearl off course into the port of St. Ives in Cornwall on the southwestern tip of England. For the French captain and crew, this was a catastrophe. They'd brought a cargo of enslaved people into British waters, where slavery was legally ambiguous and the slave trade was absolutely prohibited. The British Royal Navy actively patrolled the Atlantic and the African coast, seizing slave ships and freeing their human cargo. For a French slave trader to end up in a British port was exactly the kind of situation they would have been desperate to avoid. For Louis and his 4 fellow captives, however, the storm that terrified them was actually carrying them toward freedom, though they wouldn't have known it at the time. They might have assumed they were about to die at sea. The irony that the worst storm they'd experienced was actually their salvation wouldn't have been apparent until much later. When the Pearl docked at St. Ives, probably in late 1825 or very early 1826, the presence of enslaved Africans aboard a French vessel in an English port created a complex legal situation. British law at this time operated in a gray area regarding slavery. The 1807 Abolition Act had ended British participation in the slave trade, making it illegal for British subjects to buy, sell, or transport enslaved people. But this applied primarily to British subjects and British ships. The legal status of foreign vessels in British waters was less clear. Within England itself, the legal status of enslaved people was even more complicated. A series of court cases stretching back to the 18th century had established that slavery had no legal standing in England. The famous Somerset case of 1772 had declared that slavery was so odious that nothing could support it but positive law, and since no positive law established slavery in England, it could not exist there. But this didn't automatically free enslaved people who arrived in England, and it certainly didn't protect them if their enslavers took them back to places where slavery was legal. This is where George Stephen entered the story, and his intervention would prove decisive. Stephen was a British solicitor and barrister, who would later become one of the most important and controversial figures in the abolition movement. Born in 1794, he came from a prominent abolitionist family. His brother James Stephen was Under Secretary of State in the Colonial Office. George Stephen himself was known for his aggressive tactics, his willingness to alienate potential allies if he thought they weren't sufficiently committed to immediate emancipation, and his absolute conviction that slavery was a moral evil that demanded urgent action. Stephen was a founding member of the Agency Committee, later known as the Agency Society, a more radical faction within the broader anti-slavery movement that rejected the gradualist approach and advocated for immediate and complete emancipation. While older abolitionists had been willing to accept compromises, Stephen and his allies believed that any compromise with slavery was itself immoral. They organized public speaking tours, distributed pamphlets, coordinated petition campaigns, and generally sought to create enough public pressure to force Parliament to act. When Stephen learned about the enslaved Africans aboard the Pearl docked at St. Ives, he saw both a humanitarian crisis and an opportunity to strike a legal and political blow against the slave trade. He traveled to Cornwall or sent agents there, gathered information about the circumstances, and determined that he could invoke English legal principles to free these people. Stephen brought a writ of habeas corpus before Lord Winford, arguing that Louis and the 4 other Africans were being illegally detained aboard the Pearl. Habeas corpus is one of the oldest and most fundamental protections in English law, dating back to medieval times. The phrase means you shall have the body, and it requires authorities to produce anyone being held and justify why they're being detained. If the detention is found to be unlawful, the person must be released. Applying habeas corpus to enslaved people was a clever legal strategy. Stephen argued that the French captain had no legal authority to detain these Africans in England, that they were being held against their will without any lawful justification, and that English law required their immediate release. The ship's master mounted some opposition, probably arguing that the captives were property legally purchased in Africa, that the Pearl had only arrived in England due to emergency circumstances, and that interfering with the cargo of a foreign vessel would create diplomatic problems. But his arguments were weak, and Lord Winford discharged all 5 Africans, declaring them free to go. This was a profound moment, though its significance might not have been immediately apparent to Louis. He'd spent months as a captive, had been sold 6 times, had survived the Middle Passage, and now suddenly he was being told he was free. Free in a country whose language he didn't speak, whose customs he didn't understand, whose very existence he'd been unaware of just months earlier. The interpreter who conveyed this information to him would have struggled to explain what it meant, because freedom in the abstract is very different from freedom in practical terms. George Stephen took Louis under his protection, and this was characteristic of Stephen's approach to abolition work. He didn't just argue against slavery in abstract terms. He involved himself directly in the lives of enslaved people, offering material support and advocacy. Louis went to live in Stephen's household in London, where he would remain for approximately 5 years, from 1826 to 1831. What happened during those 5 years is mostly lost to history. We know he lived with Stephen, presumably in a household that included Stephen's family and possibly other servants. We know he learned English, well enough to communicate effectively and possibly to read and write, though we don't know if he also maintained any of his native language or if that knowledge was gradually lost. When you're the only speaker of a language in a household, in a city, possibly in an entire country, that language has no practical use, and it fades. We know he was exposed to the world of London abolitionists, a network of activists, reformers, and religious figures who were building a movement to end slavery throughout the British Empire. This network included Quakers, evangelical Christians who saw slavery as a sin, political radicals who viewed slavery as incompatible with human rights, and economic reformers who argued that free labor was more efficient than slave labor. Louis would have encountered all these perspectives, would have attended meetings and heard speeches, would have seen how the movement worked to build public support. And we know that at some point his story was written down. The exact circumstances are unclear. Thomas Pringle, the secretary of the Anti-Slavery Society, who published it in 1831, suggested in his introduction that the narrative was in Lewis's own words, with only minimal correction for grammar and to make the story coherent. But this claim should be viewed skeptically. Lewis may not have been literate enough to write the narrative himself. He may have dictated the story to George Stephen, who would have written it down, possibly asking questions to clarify details. The text may have undergone significant editing after the initial transcription. This uncertainty matters because it raises questions about authenticity. How much of what we read represents his actual words, his actual memories, his actual interpretation of his experiences? How much has been shaped by others who had their own agendas? This doesn't mean the narrative is false, but it does mean we need to read it critically. But even accounting for that uncertainty, the narrative that emerged carries enormous historical weight. It's only 2 pages long in the original publication, but those pages offer a window into the mechanics of the slave trade that few British readers would have encountered. Lewis described the raid on his village, the long march to the coast covering more than 1,000 miles, the multiple sails over 6 months, the specific goods exchanged including English guns, being loaded onto the Pearl with 80 others, the terror of the storm, the chance arrival in Cornwall, and his liberation through Stephen's intervention. And he described something else that spoke directly to the political moment. He made clear that he wanted people to know about what he'd experienced. He expressed the hope that the King of England could learn about these things and use his power to stop them. There's something profound about a young African man, torn from his home, believing that if only the right people in England knew what was happening, they would act to end it. It suggests both his faith in British power and perhaps his overly optimistic belief in British goodness. This faith was encouraged by the abolitionists around him. They genuinely believed that slavery persisted because people didn't understand how terrible it was, that education and moral persuasion would lead to political change. They believed that Parliament could be convinced to act if public opinion demanded it. And they believed that narratives like Lewis's were powerful tools for shaping that public opinion. The timing of Lewis's narrative was crucial. In 1831, Britain was in the midst of an intense national debate about slavery that had been building for years. The slave trade had been abolished for nearly a quarter century, but the institution of slavery itself continued to thrive in British Caribbean colonies. Sugar plantations in Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad, Antigua, and other islands remained sites of brutal forced labor. Enslaved people were born, worked, died, and were inherited like any other property. The Anti-Slavery Society, led by figures like Thomas Pringle, Thomas Clarkson, and William Wilberforce, though Wilberforce was in declining health by 1831, was pushing for complete emancipation. They'd been agitating since the early 1820s, organizing petition campaigns, holding public meetings, distributing literature, and lobbying Parliament. But they faced significant opposition from powerful interests. Plantation owners wielded enormous economic and political power. They'd invested substantial capital in land and enslaved people. They derived their wealth from plantation agriculture. Many of them sat in Parliament or had close connections to those who did. They argued that immediate emancipation would destroy the colonial economy, that the sugar industry would collapse, that Britain would lose a major source of wealth. They claimed that enslaved people were well treated and happy, that harsh discipline was necessary because Africans were inherently lazy and required firm control. They insisted that gradual emancipation over generations was the only practical approach. Some advocated for amelioration, improving conditions while keeping the basic system intact. Some even argued that enslaved Africans were better off in the Caribbean than they would have been in Africa, that slavery had rescued them from barbarism. These arguments were taken seriously by many in Britain. The plantation interest had the money, the political connections, and the respectability to make their case effectively. They published pamphlets and newspapers. They had sympathetic members of Parliament. They threatened economic catastrophe if slavery ended. And they benefited from racial prejudices that made many white Britons skeptical that black people could function as free laborers. It was in this context that Thomas Pringle decided to publish Mary Prince's narrative in early 1831. Mary Prince was an enslaved Bermudian woman who had escaped from her owners while in London with them in 1828. She'd worked as their domestic servant, endured years of brutal treatment, and had finally walked out of their house rather than continue serving them or return to Antigua, where she would have been re-enslaved. Her account of her experiences became the first slave narrative by a black woman published in Britain. It was a sensation, going through 3 printings in its first year. Pringle served as editor, and the narrative was taken down by Susanna Strickland, a writer who lived with the Pringle family as a guest. Strickland listened to Mary Prince tell her story and wrote it down, likely asking questions and prompting for details, then editing the result to make it readable for middle-class British readers. After completing Mary Prince's narrative, Pringle learned about Lewis's story through George Stephen, who was his colleague in the Anti-Slavery Society. Stephen had apparently dictated or helped transcribe Lewis's narrative and brought it to Pringle's attention. Pringle saw immediately how valuable it would be as a supplement to Mary's narrative. Mary Prince's narrative described what slavery was like in the British Caribbean, the daily brutality of plantation and domestic slavery, the violence of the lash and the psychological torture of being treated as property. But it couldn't explain how enslaved people had arrived in the Caribbean in the first place. Most British readers had only the vaguest understanding of the Middle Passage and the slave trade. Lewis's narrative could fill that gap, could provide the missing piece that connected African freedom to American slavery. Pringle added Lewis's narrative as an appendix to Mary Prince's history, calling it a suitable appendix and convenient supplement. The 2 narratives worked together to create a comprehensive picture of the entire system. Mary showed what slavery looked like at its destination. Louis showed how people became enslaved in the first place. Together, They demolished the comfortable fictions that allowed slavery's defenders to minimize its horrors. Lewis's narrative also served another crucial purpose that Pringle understood. It demonstrated that the abolition of the British slave trade in 1807 had been insufficient. Here was proof, walking and breathing in London, that French traders were still conducting the slave trade in 1825 and 1826. More damning, here was evidence that British manufactured goods, those English guns Louis specifically mentioned, were facilitating that trade. Britain might have officially ended its participation, but British manufacturers were still profiting from it, still producing goods specifically designed for the African market, still enabling the capture and sale of human beings. The system persisted, fed by British exports and driven by European and American demand for slave-produced sugar, cotton, coffee, and tobacco. As long as there was demand for these products and as long as slavery remained legal in the Americas, people would find ways to supply enslaved laborers. The only way to truly end British complicity was to abolish the institution entirely. When the combined narrative of Mary Prince and Louis Asa Asa appeared in print in late February or early March 1831, published by F. Wesley and A. H. Davis at Stationers' Hall Court in London, it created exactly the kind of public sensation the Anti-Slavery Society had hoped for. The book sold out rapidly. Readers were shocked by the detailed accounts of brutality, moved by the personal stories, and convinced by the specificity that made it impossible to dismiss as exaggeration. A second edition appeared on March 31, 1831. A third edition followed soon after. The Anti-Slavery Society then produced a cheap edition, priced at 1 shilling for single copies and 6 pence each if 25 or more were ordered, specifically to facilitate mass distribution. The cheap edition made the narrative accessible to working-class readers. Anti-slavery societies bought copies in bulk and distributed them at meetings, sent them to sympathetic clergy, and gave them to people newly interested in the cause. The narratives sparked intense controversy, which generated even more public attention. Pro-slavery writers attacked both Mary Prince and Thomas Pringle, questioning the accuracy of the accounts. They claimed the narratives were fabricated propaganda designed to damage the reputation of respectable colonists and destroy the colonial economy. They argued that Mary Prince was a liar who'd invented stories of abuse. James McQueen was the most virulent of these critics. He was a Scottish writer and journalist who'd spent time in the Caribbean and become a passionate defender of slavery. As editor of the Glasgow Courier and a contributor to Blackwood's Edinburgh magazine, he had significant platforms. He wrote savage reviews, calling Mary Prince a despicable tool being manipulated by abolitionists. He accused Pringle of distorting her story and using her for political purposes. These attacks led to lawsuits that kept the narratives in the public eye throughout 1831, 1832, and into 1833. Thomas Pringle sued James McQueen and Thomas Cadell, the publisher of Blackwood's, for libel. The case went to trial in 1833, and Pringle won, receiving £5 in damages. But then John Wood, Mary Prince's former owner in Antigua, sued Pringle for libel, claiming the narrative had defamed his character. Wood won his case and was awarded £25 in damages. These legal battles generated extensive newspaper coverage and forced even people who weren't particularly interested in abolition to pay attention. Mary Prince testified at both trials, providing the only recorded instance of her own voice outside her narrative. But Louis Asa Asa doesn't appear to have been involved in these legal proceedings, even though his narrative was published in the same volume. His role was different. She was fighting for her own legal freedom. Louis's legal status was already secure. He'd been freed in 1826 and had no owner trying to reclaim him. Through all of this, Louis remained a somewhat shadowy figure in the public record. Unlike Mary Prince, whose personality comes through vividly and who testified in court, Louis appears primarily through his brief testimony published in 1831. We don't know what he thought about being published, or how he felt seeing his story used as ammunition in British political debates. We don't know if he attended anti-slavery meetings or gave speeches. We don't know if he remained with George Stephen or found other work. What we do know is that his narrative raised uncomfortable questions. The other 4 Africans who had been freed from the Pearl with Louis provide a haunting detail that Pringle included. 2 of them died of measles in Hampstead shortly after gaining their freedom. Measles was a common disease in Britain that most British children contracted and recovered from. But for people from regions where measles didn't exist, the disease could be deadly. These 2 Africans had survived capture, the march to the coast, months in the barracoons, the Middle Passage, and the storm, only to die of a disease they'd never been exposed to. 2 others returned to Sierra Leone, the British colony on the west coast of Africa established as a home for freed slaves. By 1826, Sierra Leone was the only place in West Africa where formerly enslaved Africans could go with any reasonable expectation of safety. But it wasn't their home. For most freed Africans sent there, it was as foreign as England. But Louis, when offered the choice of returning to Africa via Sierra Leone or remaining in England, chose to stay. His reasoning, as recorded in his narrative, was straightforward and devastating. He was glad to be in England because he'd come to know God there. This presumably meant he'd been converted to Christianity during his time with George Stephen, perhaps attending church services, receiving religious instruction, being baptized. But more than religious conviction, Louis feared that if he returned to Africa, he might be captured and enslaved again. The slave trade had made Africa itself unsafe for Africans. The coastal regions were hunting grounds. Even if he somehow made it back to his village, the raiders might come again. Better to stay in England, where he was free, than risk going back to a place where he could be seized and sold. This fear wasn't paranoid. The coastal regions of West Africa in the 1820s and 1830s remained dangerous. The demand for enslaved people hadn't ended. Spanish and Portuguese traders continued to transport hundreds of thousands to Cuba and Brazil. American traders supplied the expanding cotton plantations of the American South. A young African man returning alone would have been extraordinarily vulnerable. So Louis stayed in England, a stranger in a strange land, cut off from his family, unable to return home without risking his freedom. His choice illuminates one of the cruelest aspects of the slave trade. It didn't just enslave individuals, it made entire regions unsafe, disrupted societies, destroyed communities, and created generational trauma that would persist long after the trade ended. In this sense, Louis's story illustrates not just the horror of individual enslavement, but the broader social destruction the slave trade caused across the African continent. It disrupted African societies at every level, created endemic instability, incentivized warfare, destroyed trust between communities, and fundamentally altered political and economic structures. The slave trade wasn't just a tragedy because millions were enslaved. It was a tragedy because it transformed Africa itself into a hunting ground where people couldn't trust their neighbors, where raids were constant, where entire regions were depopulated. The impact of Lewis's narrative on the abolition movement is difficult to measure precisely, but we can trace its influence. The combined publication in 1831 came at a crucial moment. The Reform Act of 1832 would expand the British electorate, bringing more middle-class voters into the political system and reducing the power of the West Indian plantation interest in Parliament. The reformed Parliament would prove more receptive to abolition. In 1833, 2 years after Lewis's narrative was published, Parliament passed the Slavery Abolition Act. The act freed all enslaved people in British colonies, though it included provisions that forced them to continue working as apprentices for their former owners for several years. It also compensated slave owners for their loss of property, paying them £20 million, an enormous sum. The enslaved people themselves received nothing. The Abolition Act was a compromise, flawed and incomplete, but it represented a fundamental shift. Slavery as a legal institution was ending in the British Empire. The activism of people like George Stephen and Thomas Pringle, the testimony of people like Mary Prince and Louis Asa Asa, had worked. The moral argument against slavery had prevailed, at least in Britain. But we should be careful about celebrating too completely. Even as Britain was abolishing slavery in its own colonies, the institution was expanding elsewhere. The United States wouldn't abolish slavery until 1865, after a catastrophic civil war. Brazil wouldn't abolish it until 1888. Cuba held out until 1886. The Atlantic slave trade, though diminished, continued illegally for decades. And the legacy of slavery, the racial hierarchies and economic inequalities it created, would persist long after formal abolition. For Louis Asa Asa, personally, we know almost nothing about what happened after 1831. His narrative was published, reprinted, distributed to anti-slavery societies throughout Britain. His words were read by thousands of people, used in sermons and speeches, cited in parliamentary debates. But Louis himself disappears from the historical record. We don't know when or where he died. We don't know if he ever married, had children, found meaningful work, built any kind of life in England. This absence is itself telling. Louis mattered to the abolition movement because his story was useful. Once published, once his testimony had been extracted and deployed, there was no particular reason for anyone to keep track of him. The abolitionists who championed his cause were genuinely committed to ending slavery, but their movement remained shaped by the racism and paternalism of their era. Louis was a symbol, a witness, a tool for persuasion. Whether he was seen as a fully human being with his own desires and agency is less clear. The broader historical significance of Lewis's narrative lies in what it reveals about the slave trade at a specific moment. By 1826, the trade had been illegal for Britain for nearly 2 decades, but it was still operating with considerable efficiency. The networks of capture, transport, and sale remained intact. European manufactured goods, including British guns, continued to fuel the system. African kingdoms and merchant groups continued to profit from selling their own people. Louis's testimony made all of this visible to British readers who might have assumed that abolishing the British trade had solved the problem. His narrative also reveals something about the geography of the slave trade. The fact that he was captured so far inland, then marched more than 1,000 miles to the coast, illustrates how deeply the trade had penetrated into the African interior. The coastal trading posts were just the visible edge of a vast system that reached hundreds of miles into the continent. Entire economies had reorganized themselves around capturing and transporting people to the coast. The violence and dislocation were staggering in scale, and his narrative reveals something about chance and survival. If the Pearl hadn't encountered that storm, if it hadn't been driven into St. Ives, if George Stephen hadn't learned about the Africans aboard and hadn't invoked habeas corpus, Louis would have disappeared into slavery somewhere in Europe or the Americas. His story would never have been told. He would have been one more nameless victim among millions. The fact that we know anything about him at all is due to an accident of weather and a lawyer's activism. This raises uncomfortable questions about the millions of other Louis Asa Asas whose stories we don't know, whose names we'll never learn, who lived and died in slavery without anyone recording their testimony. The slave trade consumed somewhere between 12 and 15 million Africans over 4 centuries. Each one had a name, a family, a history. Each one was captured or sold for specific reasons. Each one endured the Middle Passage with their own fears and hopes. Each one either survived to face slavery in the Americas or died during the crossing. And almost none of their individual stories survived. Louis's narrative is valuable precisely because it gives us one specific, detailed account of how the system worked at ground level. It moves slavery from abstraction to reality. We're not talking about the slave trade in general terms, about economic systems and historical forces. We're talking about a boy of 12 or 13 living in a village called Baikla, seized by raiders, marched 1,000 miles, sold 6 times, loaded onto a ship, and carried across the ocean. That specificity makes the horror real in a way that statistics cannot. The narrative also complicates our understanding of freedom. Louis was freed in 1826. But what did freedom mean for him? He was in a country where he didn't speak the language, didn't understand the customs, had no family or community ties, and couldn't safely return home. He was dependent on George Stephen's charity for housing, and presumably for food and clothing. He had no legal right to remain in Britain indefinitely. If Stephen had died or lost interest, Louis would have been on his own in London with no resources and no prospects. This precarious form of freedom was common for enslaved people who gained their liberty in Britain during this period. They were legally free, but socially and economically vulnerable. They faced discrimination in employment. They had no political rights. They could be seized and transported back to slavery if they tried to return to slave colonies. Many lived in poverty. Some turned to begging. Others found work in domestic service, perpetually dependent on the goodwill of white employers. Freedom was better than slavery, certainly, but it came with its own hardships. The fact that Louis chose to stay in England rather than risk returning to Africa tells us how thoroughly the slave trade had poisoned his homeland. Africa wasn't safe. The coast wasn't safe. Even if he could somehow make his way back to Baikla, how would he get there? He'd need to cross regions controlled by the same raiders and traders who'd sold him in the first place. The slave trade hadn't just taken him from Africa. It had made Africa itself a place of danger and exile. Looking back from our vantage point nearly 200 years later, Louis Asa Asa's story raises questions about history itself, about whose stories get told and preserved, about whose voices are recorded and whose are silenced. We have Louis's narrative only because a series of accidents and deliberate choices put his words into print. The storm that drove the Pearl into St. Ives. George Stephen's decision to invoke habeas corpus. Thomas Pringle's decision to publish the narrative alongside Mary Prince's story. the commercial success of that publication, which ensured it was reprinted and preserved. Change any one of those factors, and Louis disappears completely from the historical record. He becomes one of the millions of anonymous victims, their experiences lost forever. This reminds us that the history we have is not the history that happened. It's the history that survived, that was recorded, that someone thought was worth preserving, and that history is deeply biased toward the powerful, the literate, the socially connected, and the fortunate. Louis was fortunate, if we can use that word for someone who was captured, sold, and carried across the ocean. He was fortunate that he survived the Middle Passage when so many didn't. He was fortunate that the storm drove his ship to Cornwall. He was fortunate that George Stephen was an activist willing to fight for his freedom. He was fortunate that his story was considered useful by the abolition movement and thus preserved in print. But his fortune was always precarious, always dependent on others, always constrained by the fact that he was an African in a white-dominated world. The legacy of Louis Asa Asa is complicated. On one hand, his narrative contributed to the abolition of slavery in the British Empire, one of the great moral and political achievements of the 19th century. His testimony helped British readers understand the mechanics of the slave trade and the human cost of slavery. It strengthened the case for emancipation and helped build the public pressure that led to the 1833 Abolition Act. In that sense, his story had real historical impact. On the other hand, Louis himself remains almost invisible. We know his story, but not what happened to him. We know what he suffered, but not how he survived or thrived afterward. We know he was used by the abolition movement, but we don't know if he felt that use was worthwhile, if he was satisfied with the outcome, if he ever found peace or happiness in England. His voice comes to us mediated through others, transcribed and edited and published for purposes beyond his control. Even his name, Louis Asa Asa, may have been anglicized or adapted from whatever he originally called himself. This raises ethical questions about historical memory and the use of traumatic testimony. Louis's story was powerful precisely because it was traumatic, because it detailed suffering and violence in ways that moved readers to action. But that means his worst experiences, his most painful memories, became the most valuable parts of his story. He mattered to history because he'd been victimized. His humanity was recognized through his suffering. That's an uncomfortable reality that applies not just to Louis but to countless others whose stories of trauma become vehicles for social change. Still, we shouldn't let these complications obscure the fundamental importance of what Louis's narrative achieved. It made visible what many preferred to keep hidden. It gave specificity and detail to abstract discussions of the slave trade. It provided evidence of how the system actually worked, how people were captured and sold, what goods were exchanged, what companies profited, what nations were complicit. It demonstrated that British abolition of the slave trade had been incomplete, and that British goods continued to facilitate slavery. And, perhaps most importantly, it asserted Louis's own humanity and agency at a moment when both were under attack. By telling his story, by expressing his fears about returning to Africa, by explaining why he chose to stay in England, by stating his hope that the king might use his power to end slavery. Louis wasn't just providing information to abolitionists. He was claiming his own voice, insisting on his own perspective, demanding to be heard as a person rather than dismissed as property. The choice to include Louis's narrative alongside Mary Prince's story was strategic and powerful. Together, they created a comprehensive indictment of slavery that was harder to dismiss than either narrative alone. Mary showed what slavery was like in the colonies. Louis showed how people became enslaved. Mary described the daily brutality of bondage. Louis described the violence of capture and transport. Mary spoke for the millions already enslaved in the Caribbean. Louis spoke for the millions who'd been torn from Africa. Together, they bore witness to the full scope of slavery's horror. In the end, Louis Asa Asa's story is both unique and representative. Unique because we have his specific testimony, because we know his name and some details of his experience. Representative because his experience was shared, in its essentials, by millions of others who were captured, sold, transported, and enslaved during the 4 centuries of the Atlantic slave trade. Every person caught in that system had their own version of Louis's story, their own raid, their own march, their own sails, their own crossing, their own confrontation with a new world built on their forced labor. We remember Louis because his words survived. But in remembering him, we should also remember all those whose words didn't survive, whose names we'll never know, whose specific stories are lost. The historical record is partial and incomplete. What we know about slavery is a fraction of what happened, but that fraction, that small window that Louis's narrative provides, is enough to understand the fundamental truth. The slave trade was a vast crime against humanity, systematic and calculated, that destroyed millions of lives and shaped the modern world in ways we're still reckoning with today. Louis Asa Asa was one person, one story, one voice among millions. But his voice reached across the centuries, carried by the printed page, preserved by the historical record. And it still tells us something essential about that moment when storm winds drove a slave ship into an English port, and a young African man got a chance to speak his truth about what slavery really meant.